Some men ride into town and the birds go quiet. Colt Mercer was that kind of man. But the day Red Hollow finally held its breath wasn't because of his guns. It was because of 3 girls being sold like livestock in broad daylight, and every soul in that county looked the other way. One man didn't. What happened next would tear this town apart, expose a monster hiding behind silk dresses and forged papers, and force an entire frontier to ask itself one ugly question. How long had they let cruelty win just to keep themselves comfortable? This is that story. Like this video, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The dust never really settled in Red Hollow. It clung to everything, the storefronts, the horses, the weathered faces of men who'd spent too many years under a sun that had no interest in being kind. The town sat wedged between 2 dry ridges, like something the land had coughed up and forgotten about. There was one general store, one saloon, one church that hadn't seen a full congregation since the drought of '71, and one sheriff who'd learned long ago that the safest position a man could take in any dispute was no position at all. The nearest rail depot was 40 miles east. The nearest anything resembling law that hadn't been bought or frightened was probably twice that. Red Hollow wasn't a place people chose. It was a place people ended up. Colt Mercer had ended up there on a Thursday in late October, riding in on a gray roan with a bad left shoe and a bedroll that had seen better decades. He was 34 years old, though he looked closer to 40 when he hadn't slept, which was most of the time. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who'd learned that loud men were usually scared men, and that the ones you actually needed to worry about were the quiet ones watching the room. He had sharp eyes, the color of creek water after a storm, a jaw that hadn't met a razor in about a week, and a scar that ran from his left ear down the side of his neck in a pale, crooked line that people always wanted to ask about and never did. He wore a dark hat pulled low, a coat that was too thin for the coming winter, and a Colt single-action army on his right hip that looked used rather than displayed. No pearl handle, no decoration, just blued steel worn smooth at the edges from years of being drawn and holstered and drawn again. His reputation had a way of arriving before he did, not in the way of legends that grew prettier with distance. Colt Mercer's reputation was the kind that made saloon conversation drop to a murmur when his name came up, the kind that respectable men cited as reason to cross the street rather than pass close. He had killed men. That much was documented, more or less accurately, depending on who was counting and why. He had spent 8 months in a territorial prison outside of Flagstaff for a fight that 3 witnesses described 3 different ways. He had worked as a hired gun, a cattle driver, a debt collector, and for one strange winter in Colorado, a deputy for a marshal who later turned out to be running a land fraud operation that landed 4 men in prison and 1 in a shallow grave. Colt had not been among the imprisoned or the buried. That alone said something, though what it said depended entirely on your opinion of the man. He rode into Red Hollow because his horse needed shoeing, he needed supplies, and because someone at the last trading post had mentioned there was seasonal cattle work available on a ranch about 8 miles north of town. That was the sum total of his interest in the place. He tied the roan up outside the livery, arranged for the shoe, told the stable boy the horse bit on the left side and meant it, and then walked down the main street of Red Hollow with the loose, unhurried stride of a man who had walked into 100 towns just like this one, and found nothing in any of them worth rushing toward. The saloon was called the Iron Bit. It had a hand-painted sign with a horseshoe on it and a door that didn't quite hang level, so it always stood about 2 inches open no matter how hard you pushed it closed. Colt had been in better saloons and considerably worse ones. He ordered whiskey, didn't ask what kind, paid what was asked without complaint, and took a corner table where he could see the door and both windows. He was on his 2nd drink when he first heard the name Celine Voss. It came from the table nearest the bar. 2 men in ranch clothes, both of them speaking in the careful, lowered tones of people discussing something they weren't sure they should be discussing in public. Heard she's filing on the Ashford grazing rights next week. 3rd time she's expanded this year. Let her file. Nobody's stopping her. Nobody ever stops her. A pause. The sound of a glass being set down. You hear about the youngest one at the Heller auction last month? Heard something. Collapsed right there in the pen. Working stock in 100-degree heat since 5 in the morning. Girl can't be more than 16. That's Celine's business, not ours. I know it's not ours. Another pause, longer this time. Still. The other man said nothing. Colt stared at his whiskey glass. He hadn't meant to listen. He was good at not listening. It was a skill you developed on the frontier when getting involved in other people's trouble, was how you ended up on a ridge in the dark with somebody's rifle pointed at your back. He had the scar to prove that lesson had been learned the hard way. He finished his drink and ordered a third, but the word youngest sat in his head like a stone that wouldn't shake loose. He found out more than he wanted to over the next 2 days. Red Hollow was a small town, and small towns had a particular economy of information. Everyone knew everything and said nothing directly. But Colt had spent enough time in small towns to know how to read the spaces between words. He listened at the general store while he resupplied. He listened at the livery while he waited on his horse. He had a meal at a woman named Hattie's boarding house and let her talk, which she was clearly hungry to do. The story of the Ashford Ranch came together in pieces, and none of the pieces were pretty. Gerald Ashford had been a cattle rancher. Not rich, but solvent, respected, the kind of man who paid his debts and kept his word. He'd had 3 daughters from his first wife, who died young. Mara, the oldest at 22, Eliza, who was 20, and June, who had just turned 17. About 4 years back, Gerald had made what the town now privately agreed was the worst decision of his life. He'd married Celine Voss, a widow from a town 3 counties north, whose late husband had left her with money, connections, and an aptitude for business that people had called impressive, right up until the moment they realized it was actually something considerably darker. Gerald Ashford had died 11 months after the wedding. A fever, the doctor said. Sudden. Tragic. Nobody in Red Hollow said anything else about it out loud, but Colt noticed the way Hattie's eyes moved when she mentioned it. A flicker, just for a second, gone before it fully formed. With Gerald dead, Celine had inherited controlling interest in the ranch. The daughters had a claim, but a claim required a lawyer, and lawyers required money, and by the time Gerald's estate had been sorted through Celine's accounting, there was remarkably little money to be found. She had kept the girls on the ranch, working, not as family. She works them like hired hands, Hattie told him, refilling his coffee without being asked. Worse than hired hands, because hired hands get paid and get days off. Those girls don't get either. Mara tried to take it to the judge last spring, Judge Holloway. But Celine had gotten to him first. Land filing was clean, debts were documented proper, and Mara walked out of that courthouse with nothing. And the town? Colt said. Hattie set down the coffee pot. What about the town? You said she controls the supply contracts, the store credit. Celine buys through Whitmore's, which means Whitmore doesn't bite the hand that feeds. Half the ranchers in the valley owe their seed credit to her financial arrangements one way or another. Hattie sat down across from him. She was a heavy-set woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and a directness that Colt found refreshing. You want the plain truth? Most people in Red Hollow would help those girls if it didn't cost them anything. But it cost them, and that's all there is to it. Nobody just helped them? No family? No. Gerald's brother came through last year, offered to take the girls. Celine produced a document saying Gerald had appointed her sole guardian in case of his death, and that any attempt to remove the girls constituted theft of contracted labor. Hattie shook her head. Don't know if that document was real. Do know that the brother left alone and nobody's seen him since. Colt was quiet for a moment. What's she planning to do with them? Hattie looked at him for a long moment. Nothing that's going to end well for any of them, she said finally. I'll tell you that much. I've heard things about arrangements being made, men coming in from out east to look at the ranch, and not just the cattle. Men looking to buy? Men looking to acquire, Hattie said, and the way she said that word made the distinction entirely, brutally clear. Colt told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself that every morning of the 3 days he spent in Red Hollow, waiting on a cattle outfit to come through town so he could ask about the seasonal work. He told himself that while he ate. He told himself that while he drank. He told himself that with the particular firmness of a man who had been told similar things by better people than himself and still hadn't managed to listen. He had his own problems. A prison record that followed him like a shadow. A reputation that made legitimate employment a conversation that started awkward and usually ended quickly. $62 to his name, not counting the horse. No land, no ties, no plan beyond the one day ahead of him. Getting involved in somebody else's war, especially a war involving a woman like Celine Voss, who by all accounts had the local law, local commerce, and a handful of hired enforcers on her side, was not just foolish, It was the kind of foolish that got you killed in a way that nobody would investigate particularly hard afterward. He told himself all of this. And then on the fourth morning, he rode out to the Ashford Ranch to ask about the seasonal cattle work, because he'd heard they might have an opening, and because that was a completely reasonable thing to do with no ulterior motive whatsoever. He believed about half of that. The Ashford Ranch was a decent piece of land in better days, you could tell. The main house had bones, solid timber frame, a wide porch, a good well placement. But everything about it had the look of deliberate neglect. The fence lines that should have been mended weren't. The vegetable garden near the east side of the house had been let go. The barn needed paint and at least 2 boards replaced on the east wall. Not the neglect of poverty, exactly. The neglect of people too exhausted to do anything beyond the bare minimum of what they were forced to do. He was still taking in the yard when the front door opened and a woman stepped out onto the porch with a shotgun leveled at his chest. She was not small, not fragile. She had dark hair pulled back from a face that was not pretty in any simple way, but was striking in the way that hard-won things are striking. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that shouldn't have been there at 22, and her jaw was set with a kind of determined fury that suggested the shotgun was not for show. This was Mara Ashford. "You stop right there," she said, no waver in her voice. Colt stopped his horse about 30 feet from the porch. He raised both hands slowly, keeping them visible. "I'm looking for cattle work. Heard there might be—" "You heard wrong." Her eyes moved over him with professional suspicion. "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I'm passing through." "Nobody in this county passes through this specific property on accident. You ride past the main road and up a quarter-mile of private trail to get here. So who sent you?" She had a point. He had, in fact, ridden up a quarter-mile of private trail. "Hattie mentioned you might need a hand," he said. Something shifted in Mara's face. A flicker, almost imperceptible. But she didn't lower the shotgun. "Hattie should mind her business." "Probably," Colt agreed. "I'm Colt Mercer." A pause. He watched her process the name. He could see the moment she recognized it. Her grip on the shotgun actually tightened. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "Figured you might." "Men with your reputation don't come looking for cattle work." "Men with my reputation have trouble finding anything else," he said. It came out more honest than he'd intended. Mara studied him. He stayed still. His horse shuffled, and he let it. After a long moment, she said, "I didn't place any work listing anywhere." "I know. I probably shouldn't have ridden up. I'll go." He was actually turning when the second voice reached him. "Mara." It came from around the side of the house. Quieter. Careful. He turned back. A second young woman had appeared at the corner of the building, lighter-haired than Mara, with the same bone structure but an expression that ran more toward calculation than confrontation. She was wiping her hands on a work cloth and looking at Colt with the kind of focused attention that made him feel like he was being read rather than seen. This, he would later learn, was Eliza. "Let him speak," Eliza said to her sister. We need the north fence mended before the stock gets into Voss's field, and she fines us for it again." Eliza's eyes stayed on Colt. "Can you work fence?" "Yes." "Roof patch?" "Yes." "Can you drive cattle?" "That's what I do." Eliza looked at her sister. Something passed between them. The shorthand of people who have lived in close quarters under difficult circumstances and learned to communicate in glances and fractions of expression. Mara's jaw worked. She didn't lower the shotgun yet, but she didn't raise it higher either. "Celine checks on us Tuesdays and Fridays," she said finally. "You'd need to not be visible on those days." Colt blinked. "You're offering me a job while she's watching you?" "I'm offering you something to do with your time," Mara said flatly. "I'm not offering you money, because we don't have any. I'm not offering you permanence, because we don't have that either. I'm offering you a place to sleep in the barn, 2 meals a day, and the satisfaction of knowing the work needed doing." Her chin lifted slightly. "You can take it or leave it." Colt looked at the fence line. He looked at the barn. He looked at the house and the porch and the woman standing on it with a shotgun and 2 decades of hard living written across a face that should have been younger than it looked. "Where's the third sister?" he asked. Mara's expression didn't change. "Working, as she always is." "Is she all right?" A pause. "Define all right." He got off his horse. He met June that evening when she came in from the south pasture at the kind of hour that made working from before sunrise to after sundown feel less like labor and more like a sentence. She was 17, small-framed, with Mara's dark hair and Eliza's watchful eyes, and something in her face that neither of her sisters quite had. A particular kind of brightness that exhaustion hadn't fully managed to kill yet, though you could see it was trying. She walked with a slight favoring of her right leg, and when she sat down at the table she did it in the careful way of someone whose body had stopped asking and started demanding. Mara put food in front of her before anything else. June ate without being told to, which told Colt everything about how often she was given the option. She looked at him across the table with uncomplicated directness. "You're the man Eliza said might stay." "Might," Colt agreed. "Are you going to?" He looked down at the food in front of him. Salt pork and cornbread that was probably better than what he deserved, given that he'd done nothing yet to earn it. "Appears so." June nodded once, as if that settled something. Then she went back to eating. He noticed she ate like someone who'd been hungry often enough to not take the presence of food for granted. Quickly, but not messily. Focused. No conversation until the plate was clear. None of the sisters talked much during that first meal. They sat at a table in a kitchen that had clearly been a warm room once. There were curtains someone had made by hand, a shelf of preserved jars, evidence of a household that had operated with care and intention, and they were quiet in the way of people who had gotten out of the habit of expecting good things from a day's end. After June finished, she looked at Colt again. "She'll find out you're here," she said. Not as a warning, just as a statement of fact. "Celine? She finds out everything. She has people who watch." "Who?" "The hands she kept on. 3 of them. They're not really ranch hands, not anymore." Eliza looked up from her plate. "Don't tell him everything in the first evening, June." "He should know what he's riding into," June said mildly. "He should find out gradual, so he doesn't leave." Colt looked between them. "I'm sitting right here." Both of them looked at him with an expression that was startlingly identical, the particular combination of sorry and not sorry that sisters seemed to have patented. "Then you heard," Eliza said simply. He stayed. The first week was work, the honest, physical, uncomplicated kind that Colt had always found easier than most human interaction. He mended the north fence line. He patched the barn roof where rain had been getting in and rotting the second support beam. He rehung the barn door that had come off its upper hinge. He looked at the horses. There were 4 left, where there had apparently been 12 before Celine's management began redistributing the ranch's assets in her direction, and tended to the 2 that needed attention. I was careful about Tuesdays and Fridays. On those days he made himself scarce, staying in the far fields, keeping the horse out of the yard, making sure none of the signs of his presence were immediately visible from the road. He watched from a distance the first Tuesday as a wagon came up the trail, and he got his first real look at Celine Voss. She arrived like something that had been prepared. That was the only way he could think to describe it. The wagon was well kept, the horses matched, and Celine herself was dressed in town clothes that were expensive and slightly too formal for a ranch inspection, which Colt suspected was the point entirely. She was somewhere in her early 40s, tall, with auburn hair that she wore up and secured with pins that probably cost more than most men in Red Hollow made in a month. She was, objectively speaking, handsome. She also had the eyes of someone doing mathematics while talking about other things. He watched her move through the yard from his position behind the far fence line. He watched how she spoke to the girls. Not loud, not visibly cruel, just relentlessly diminishing, pointing at things, making notes in a small ledger she carried, watching Mara's face with the attentiveness of someone who enjoyed observing the effect of their presence on others. 2 of the hired men stayed in the wagon. A third walked the perimeter. Not ranch business, security. Celine stayed 40 minutes, made Mara sign something in the ledger, and left. He came back from the far field to find Mara in the barn, standing with her forehead pressed against her horse's neck. Not crying, just standing there, breathing. Emad assured she heard his footsteps, so she knew he was coming. He picked up the gear he'd left by the stall and went about putting it away without comment. After a moment, Mara said, "She added another charge. Water rights usage. Apparently the well that's been on this property for 30 years is technically on the border, and she's had it resurveyed." Colt didn't say anything. "We owe her $940 as of today's accounting." The bitterness in Mara's voice was flat and precise, like a knife that had been sharpened so many times it had lost most of its blade. She had something every visit: water usage, grazing boundary fees, penalties for repairs we make without prior written approval. There's always something new. Does she have legal standing for any of it? Colt asked. Some of it, enough of it. Judge Holloway. I know about Holloway. Mara lifted her head from the horse's neck and looked at him. How much do you actually know about our situation? Enough, he said honestly. Not all of it. She looked at him for a long moment. The suspicion in her eyes wasn't unfriendly. It was the considered, earned suspicion of someone who had been given multiple reasons to distrust help offered without obvious cost. Why are you still here? She said. He thought about lying, about giving her something tidy and believable. He was good at that. But there was something in the way she asked it, direct, without performance, that made the easy lie feel like an insult. I'm not entirely sure, he said. I keep thinking I'll leave in the morning, and then I don't. It wasn't a satisfying answer. He knew that. But Mara nodded once, slowly, like it was the first honest thing anyone had said to her in a while. The work with Eliza was a different kind of education, where Mara operated from the front, visible, confrontational when required, absorbing the direct pressure of Celine's management, so her sisters didn't have to. Eliza operated from somewhere slightly sideways of direct sight. She was the one who kept the actual accounts, running a parallel set of books against Celine's ledger in a composition notebook she kept hidden behind a false panel in the root cellar floor. She showed them to Colt 3 weeks into his stay, on a cold morning when Mara had ridden out to check the east herd and June was still sleeping. She's been overcharging since the beginning, Eliza said. She laid the notebook open on the kitchen table and pointed at columns of numbers in handwriting so small and precise it looked almost printed. I've tracked every charge against what the actual market rate was on the date she applied it. The discrepancies are significant. Colt looked at the numbers. He was not an educated man in any formal sense, but he understood accounting well enough. He'd spent enough years watching people get taken by people who were smarter with a ledger than they were. How significant. Over 4 years, she's overcharged us by approximately $400 in fees that have no legitimate basis, and that's being conservative. Does that help you legally? Eliza looked at him. If Holloway was a different judge, it might. As it stands, I'd need to get this in front of someone who isn't in her pocket. She paused. There's a circuit judge who comes through Dunbar County twice a year, name's Reeves. I've heard he's clean. Not a friend of Celine's, he's due in the spring. That's months away. Yes, Eliza said. I know. She closed the notebook and held it in her hands with the careful attention you gave to a thing that had taken considerable risk to create. There's also something else, she said. Something I found in the papers Mara signed last month. I don't fully understand it, but it worries me. She produced another folded document from inside the notebook's back cover. Colt unfolded it and read it twice. His jaw tightened. This is a betrothal arrangement, he said. A preliminary one. It's not finalized. But it's signed by Celine as guardian, and the party named is a man in Prescott. Eliza's voice was entirely steady, which was more frightening than if it hadn't been. He's 61. He runs cattle and a small mining operation, and he's had 2 previous wives who both died within 3 years of marrying him. Colt set the paper down. Which of you? Mara. She knows? No. A silence sat between them. She's going to sign Mara over, Eliza said quietly. And then June, and then probably me, though she'll keep me longest because I'm the one who actually manages the cattle operation effectively. She'll strip as much value as she can first. Colt stood up from the table and walked to the window. The ranch yard was empty in the early morning light. The mountains in the distance were already showing snow at the peaks. You've been sitting on this, he said. I've been figuring out what to do with it. And? A pause. I don't know yet, but I'm more comfortable having it in front of 2 sets of eyes. He turned from the window. Eliza was watching him with those measuring, careful eyes that always made him feel like she was solving for an unknown variable. Mara can't find out about this yet, Eliza said. She'll go straight at Celine with it, and it'll end badly. She needs to know, but not until we have something to do besides react. You're asking me to sit on it too. I'm asking you to help me figure out what to do about it. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the paper. He thought about $62 and a bad horseshoe, and the fact that he'd ridden up a private trail on a lie he barely believed himself. All right, he said. November settled over Red Hollow with no particular gentleness. The work continued. Colt fell into the rhythms of the ranch the way he fell into most things that required his body and left his mind mostly free, fully, without complaint, doing more than was asked, because there was a great deal that needed doing, and he had the capacity to do it. He mended, drove, built, fixed. He got the winter hay storage organized properly. He got the cattle through the first cold snap without losing a single head, which June pointed out was an improvement over the previous 2 years running. June was a revelation of a different kind. She was 17, yes, and she carried the marks of being overworked in ways that made him quietly furious in the back of his mind when he looked at her too long. The roughness of her hands, the careful way she moved after long days, the habit she'd developed of eating quickly and silently as though the meal might be taken away. But she was also, behind all that, startlingly sharp. She knew every inch of the cattle operation by instinct. She knew which cows were likely to break fence, in which weather, which bulls needed watching, which sections of the grazing land were running thin and needed rotation. She had the kind of knowledge that didn't come from books, but from years of paying close attention to things. And she had all of it at 17 in a way that men twice her age rarely did. She'd also started talking to Colt. Not in the guarded, measuring way of her sisters, Mara's wariness and Eliza's strategic assessment, but directly, practically, the way people talked when they didn't have the energy to manage the conversation and just needed to say things. "Do you think Celine is going to sell us?" she asked him one morning, matter-of-factly, while they were mending a stretch of fence in the south field. He kept his hands on the wire he was stringing. "What makes you say that?" "Eliza's been quieter than usual. That means she knows something she's not telling us yet." June glanced at him, and the way that man in the suit looked at Mara when he came through with Celine 3 weeks ago. He wasn't looking at the ranch. Colt set down the fence tool. "You saw that?" "I see most things," June said, without boast. "Just fact." "I've learned to." I was quiet for a moment. "Eliza's working on it." "I know, she's always working on something." June pulled the wire to tension and held it while he secured it. "I just want someone to tell me the truth about how bad it is, instead of trying to protect me from it. I'm not a child." "No," Colt said. "You're not." She looked at him with those watchful eyes. "So, how bad is it?" He thought about what Eliza had told him. He thought about the document from the notebook. He thought about a man in Prescott with 2 dead wives. "Bad enough that we need to be smart about it," he said. "Not so bad that there's nothing to be done." "You're not going to tell me specifics?" "Not yet." "Because you promised Eliza." He looked at her. She almost smiled. "She trusts you more than she lets on," June said. "Coming from Eliza, that's significant." She went back to the fence. It was Hattie who came with the news that changed the shape of everything. She rode out to the ranch on a cold Wednesday morning in late November, which was unusual enough that Colt saw Mara's expression sharpen the moment she spotted the wagon coming up the trail. Hattie was not a woman who made unnecessary trips. She came into the kitchen and sat down and accepted the coffee Eliza poured without preamble, and then she said, "The Cattlemen's Association gathering is set for the 2nd week of December. Whitmore's hosting it at the stockyard. Every rancher in the valley will be there, plus buyers coming up from the south and east." "We know," Mara said. "We were planning to bring the winter stock. There's something else." Hattie set her coffee cup down. "I got a letter from my cousin in Prescott. She's been keeping an ear out, like I asked her to." A careful silence fell over the kitchen. Hattie looked at Mara. "Celine's been in correspondence with a man named Hartley, Cornelius Hartley. He's coming to the gathering." Eliza's face didn't move. Colt looked at the table. Mara looked between them. "Why do I feel like you two know who that is?" "He's a rancher," Eliza said carefully. "He's a buyer," Hattie said, and the way she said it made clear she knew what was being bought. "He's coming to look at the Ashford property, and the Ashford arrangements." Mara's expression went through 3 things in rapid succession: confusion, comprehension, and then a cold, compressed fury that was somehow worse to watch than anger would have been. "She's already made arrangements." "Preliminary ones," Eliza said. Mara turned to look at her sister. "How long have you known?" "A month." "Eliza, I didn't want you going at her before we had a plan. You know what you are when you're—" "I am fine when I have information." Mara's voice came out harder than she meant it to. You could see her feeling that, pulling it back slightly. "I am not a weapon you have to point. I'm your sister." Eliza looked at her steadily. "I know that." A beat. "Tell me everything," Mara said. "All of it. Right now." Eliza told her. The kitchen was very quiet while she did. When it was done, Mara sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and said nothing for a long time. Colt watched her face and saw something getting organized behind it. Not hot anger, but something colder and more calculated. Something deciding. The gathering, she said finally. Hartley will be there. Yes, Hattie said. Celine will be there. She always attends. Mara looked at Colt across the table. It was the first time she'd looked at him in the last several minutes. She'd been keeping her eyes away, which he'd understood was because looking at him would require acknowledging that he'd known and kept it from her, and she wasn't ready for that yet. What would you do? She asked him. If it were you. He thought about it seriously. I wouldn't go at her directly. Not yet. She's too dug in with Holloway and the supply contracts. Any direct challenge from you, any legal move, she'll tie it up for months, and the gathering will come and go, and Hartley will have whatever he came for. Then what? She built her power on people not looking too closely at her papers. The water rights, the betrothal contract, the debt accounting. He looked at Eliza. If those books of yours are right, they're right. Then everything she's built has cracks in it. You just need the right eyes on those cracks at the right time. The gathering, Eliza said slowly. Every rancher in the valley. Buyers from out of the territory. And if we can get word to the circuit judge's clerk about what's in those documents. Reeves isn't due until spring. His clerk travels with the Cattle Association to make the winter records official, Hattie said. Her voice had something different in it now. A kind of tentative electricity. The sound of a person who's been waiting a long time for the particular shape of a possibility to show itself. He'll be at the gathering. The kitchen was quiet again. June had come in at some point during the conversation. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her expression set in that particular stillness of someone who has just decided something. We're going to the gathering, June said. Not a question. Mara looked at her youngest sister. Something moved in her face. A kind of ache, brief and then contained. Yeah, Mara said. We are. The second week of December came in hard, with a cold front that blew down from the northern ridges and made the ground iron stiff underfoot. The sky was the color of a bruise most mornings, heavy, low, the kind of sky that suggested weather was coming and didn't particularly care what your plans were. Colt spent the week before the gathering doing two things. The first was the visible work, preparing the cattle for the drive to the stockyard, getting the Ashford stock looking as good as it could look for buyers who were coming in with money and expecting to use it. The second was the invisible work, the kind he'd spent years learning in places that didn't teach what they were teaching. He rode into Red Hollow 3 times that week on errands that had nothing to do with fence wire or salt blocks. The first trip, he found a man named Declan Pope, who had worked as a territorial records clerk before Churchill for a drinking problem had cost him the position and deposited him in Red Hollow. Declan was 45, dry for the last 2 years, sharp as he'd ever been, and carrying a substantial grudge against the kind of property fraud he'd spent years watching wealthy landowners perpetrate. Colt bought him 2 cups of coffee and let him talk about the water rights laws for about an hour. He left with a considerably better understanding of what Celine's well resurvey could and couldn't legally claim. The second trip, he found the Ashford ranch hand who had been kept on by Celine, a young man named Tom Briggs, who was 20 years old and had a look about him of someone who hadn't quite understood how he'd ended up in the situation he was in. Colt didn't threaten him. He just asked him questions, carefully, about what he'd witnessed, and let the young man work through the arithmetic of his own position without help. Tom Briggs left that conversation looking considerably more uncertain about his current employer than when he'd arrived. The third trip, he sent a letter. It was addressed to the office of Judge Reeves's circuit clerk, care of the Dunbar County Cattlemen's Association. He didn't tell the sisters about any of it, not because he was keeping things from them, but because he'd learned, in the course of 34 years of getting things wrong and occasionally right, that some things only worked if they were built quietly and then used all at once. He thought about the gathering. He thought about Celine's face, that calculator's expression, always doing math, always 3 moves ahead. He thought, let's see how she does when the math changes. The night before the gathering, Mara found him in the barn after the others had gone inside. She stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the lantern light. Colt was checking the tack one last time, not because it needed checking again, but because his hands needed something to do. I want to apologize, she said. You don't need to. I do. I was hard on you when I found out about the paper. She came further into the barn and leaned against the stall rail. You and Eliza were trying to give me something useful instead of just something upsetting. I know that. You had reason to be angry, he said. I always have reason to be angry, she said, with a dryness that was not quite humor but adjacent to it. I'm working on being smart about it instead. He kept working the leather. You're doing fine. I'm scared about tomorrow, she said. It came out matter of fact, not as a confession, but as a statement, like she'd decided honesty was the most efficient option available. I've been scared for 4 years. I've gotten pretty good at operating through it, but tomorrow it's going to be in public, and there are men who will have come to finalize a deal I didn't agree to, and I'm going to have to keep my face right and not... She stopped. And not what? Colt said. And not walk up to Celine Voss and introduce her face to the nearest solid surface, Mara said calmly. He almost laughed. It came out as a small exhale instead. Can you hold that for one more day? I can hold it for exactly as long as I need to and not 1 second more. He put down the bridle and looked at her properly. She was leaning against the stall with her arms crossed and her chin up, and she looked tired in the deep-down way of someone who has been fighting for so long that rest itself felt like a foreign language. But her eyes were clear, her jaw was set. She was not someone who was going to break. That had never been in question. We've got the account books, he said. We've got the betrothal document showing she signed something as guardian without the ward's knowledge. We've got Tom Briggs, who I believe is going to have a crisis of conscience tomorrow, at roughly the moment it becomes useful. And there's a letter that may or may not have reached the right desk. Mara was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you doing this? She said. Really? Not the thing you said to me before about not knowing, the actual reason. He thought about it. He didn't look away. Because I looked at your sister collapse in a livestock pen, he said quietly, and everyone around me kept doing what they were doing, and I thought, I've been the man who kept doing what he was doing, a lot of times, and I'm tired of it. It wasn't heroic. It didn't sound heroic even to him. It was just what it was. Mara looked at him for a moment longer. Then she pushed off the stall rail, straightened up, and said, Get some sleep. We leave at first light. She walked out of the barn. He stood there in the lantern light with the leather tack in his hands, and the cold coming in through the boards, and the sound of the wind against the roof, and felt something that he couldn't name precisely, something that lived between dread and purpose, between the specific fear of tomorrow and the strange, uncomfortable warmth of not being alone in it. He got some sleep. It wasn't particularly restful, but it was enough. The stockyard at Whitmore's was the largest open structure in the valley, a long, low building with a corrugated iron roof that amplified every sound inside it into something that felt larger than it was. On ordinary days, it smelled of cattle and sawdust and old leather. On the day of the winter gathering, it smelled like all of that, plus the particular mix of wool coats, pipe tobacco, and barely contained tension that came with putting every significant landowner in a 50-mile radius into the same building at the same time with money on the table. They arrived before the crowd thickened, which was intentional. Mara drove the supply wagon with the stock records. Eliza sat beside her with the notebook tucked inside her coat against her chest, underneath 2 layers of wool, in a position she could reach quickly with her left hand. June rode alongside on the brown mare, looking ahead at the stockyard with an expression that was carefully neutral and almost convincing. Colt rode a length behind the wagon, which was also intentional, visible enough to be a presence, far enough back to give the impression that he was his own thing, unconnected. I was scanning the yard before the wagon even stopped. There were already 30-odd men working the outer pens, moving stock, setting up the auction boards. He recognized faces from Red Hollow. Whitmore himself near the main entrance, talking to 2 men Colt didn't know. Sheriff Baines standing near the far water trough with a cup of something and the posture of a man who hoped nothing would be asked of him today. The circuit clerk's table was set up inside the main structure, toward the back. He could see the corner of it past the open doors, the territorial seal on the hanging banner above it. The clerk was already there. Colt let out a breath he hadn't fully realized he'd been holding. The letter had reached the right desk. He didn't know yet what that meant in practical terms, but it meant someone official was present, and that was a piece of the board he needed on the right square. He dismounted and tied his horse to the far rail, away from the Ashford wagon, making the distance visible. and walked into the stockyard through the side entrance. He found Declan Pope near the water trough about 20 minutes after arrival, which was where they'd agreed to meet if both of them made it. Declan was dressed better than Colt had expected. A clean coat, a collar that had been pressed, and he had the sharp-eyed sobriety of a man who'd been preparing himself for something. He handed Colt a folded piece of paper without preamble. Water Rights Law, Territorial Statute 1869, amended 1874, Declan said quietly, his eyes on the middle distance. The relevant clause is the second paragraph on the second page. If a well predates property boundary demarcation by more than 10 years, the resurvey can be challenged on the basis of prescriptive use rights. The Ashford well was dug in 1861. Celine Voss commissioned her resurvey in 1879. That's 18 years, Colt said. The statute requires 10. She doesn't have a legal leg to stand on with that water charge, and the fees derived from it are retroactively invalid. Declan paused. That's about $140 of the debt gone by my calculation. Can you say that in front of the clerk? Declan looked at him sideways. That's what I came for, isn't it? I'm asking if you're steady enough to do it. A pause. Something moved in Declan's face, not offense exactly, but the acknowledgement of a man who knew he'd given people reason to ask that question. I've been steady for 2 years, he said, and I've been wanting to do something useful with my life for about as long. So yes, I'm steady. Colt pocketed the paper. All right, stay close, but not visible. I'll find you when the time is right. He moved back into the body of the gathering. He saw Celine Voss arrive at 9:15. She came in through the main entrance with 2 of her hired men flanking her at a distance that was professionally unobtrusive and entirely intentional. She was dressed in a deep green coat with fur at the collar that probably cost more than the annual operation budget of half the ranches in the room. She moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had calculated in advance that the room would make way for her, and was being proven right. Behind her, about 10 feet back, walked Cornelius Hartley. Colt had expected someone obvious, a predator with a predator's face. Instead, Hartley was grandfatherly, with a round, reddened face and white whiskers, and the bearing of a successful businessman who was used to being treated with deference. He wore an expensive suit that didn't quite fit him through the shoulders and carried a hat he didn't put on indoors. He had the hands of a man who hadn't done physical labor in 2 decades. He looked around the gathering with the mild, interested gaze of someone shopping at a country fair. When his eyes moved to where the Ashford sisters stood near their stock display, he looked for approximately 3 seconds before looking away. That was enough. Colt felt something cold and functional settle in his chest, the particular feeling he associated with moments when a situation stopped being theoretical and became real. He turned away from Hartley and went to find the circuit clerk. The clerk's name was Morrison. He was young, mid-20s, meticulous in the way of people who care deeply about doing their specific job correctly, with ink-stained fingers and a coat that needed hemming. He was seated at the back table organizing territorial records when Colt sat down across from him. "Mr. Morrison," Colt said. Morrison looked up. "Yes? I sent a letter to your office 3 days ago. I don't know if you received it or if you've had time to look at the documents I described." Morrison's expression shifted, recognition, and something more cautious entering his face. "I received it," he said carefully. "Then you know what I'm going to ask. I know what you suggested in the letter, yes." Morrison set down his pen and looked at Colt with the frank assessment of someone who was young but not naive. "I want to be clear that my jurisdiction today is recording and certification. I'm not a judge. I cannot void contracts or overturn legal arrangements. I know that. What I can do," Morrison continued, in a slightly different register, "is certify documents as genuine or fraudulent, witness affidavits, and flag discrepancies in territorial filings for review by the circuit court. That's what I'm asking for. If what your letter described is accurate, it is. I'll have you the documents this morning." Morrison looked at him for a long moment. He was young, but Colt had the sense that he'd been waiting for precisely this kind of moment, the way that conscientious people sometimes waited for the job to actually matter. "I'll need to see everything," Morrison said. "Primary documents, not copies. And I'll need a witness to their origin." "You'll have it." He stood up from the table. Morrison watched him go with an expression that was somewhere between professional gravity and the barely contained alertness of someone who had just been told the morning was going to be considerably more interesting than expected. Mara was harder to find than he expected because she was working, moving through the gathering with the Ashford stock records, talking to buyers with the focus of someone who needed sales to matter regardless of everything else happening today. When Colt finally caught her near the South Pen, she read his expression and turned from the man she was talking to with a brief apology. "It's time," he said. "Hartley's here?" "Yes. And the clerk is ready to look at Eliza's books and the contract document. Where is she?" Mara scanned the room. She was near there. She nodded toward the east side of the building. "June's with her." "You need to get them to Morrison's table without making it obvious." "Without making it obvious," Mara repeated. "Celine watches everything. If she sees all three of you moving toward the clerk's table together, she'll know something is happening." Mara thought for about 2 seconds. "Eliza goes first. She can say she needs a boundary survey certified. That's legitimate on its face. June and I come separately, 5 minutes apart." "Good." She started to move, then stopped and turned back. "What are you doing while we do that?" "I'm going to have a conversation with Tom Briggs," he said. Her jaw tightened. "And if he's not going to cooperate? Then we have what we have without him." He held her eyes. "But I think he will." She held his gaze for a moment, searching for something she seemed to find, or at least find sufficiently, and then turned and moved through the crowd. Tom Briggs was 20 years old and had the look of a young man who had been making a decision for several weeks and hadn't reached the end of it yet. Colt found him near the outer pens, doing something with a feed bucket that didn't really need doing. He came up beside him and leaned on the fence rail and looked at the cattle and said nothing for a moment. Tom kept working the bucket. "I figured you'd come find me today," he said, without looking up. "You figured right. I don't want trouble." "Nobody wants trouble," Colt said. "Most people end up with it anyway. The difference is usually whether you chose it or it was chosen for you." Tom set the bucket down and looked at him sideways. He had a young face that was trying to look older than it was, and he had the eyes of someone who had seen things he hadn't expected to see when he'd taken this job. "What did you see?" Colt asked. A long pause. "She had the document notarized at Whitmore's office," Tom said quietly. "The betrothal one. I drove her there. The notary, Henderson, the one on Grain Street. He stamped it without reading it. She pays him to do that. He stamps whatever she puts in front of him." Colt kept his eyes on the cattle. "Did you know what was in the document?" "Not when I drove her. I found out after." Another pause. "That girl? The oldest one?" "I've worked around her for a year. She works harder than anyone I've ever seen. And Celine's going to—" He stopped, swallowed. "I got a sister," he said. "She's 19. Colt waited. "What do you need me to say?" Tom asked. "What you just told me. In front of the circuit clerk. The notary arrangement, Henderson's name, what you saw." Tom's face worked through something. "Celine will know it was me." "Yes, she will." "I'll lose the job." "You'll lose a job," Colt said. "There's a difference." He let that sit for a moment. "I won't tell you. It costs nothing. It does. But you already know what it costs to stay quiet. You've been paying that for a while." The cattle moved in the pen. Somewhere across the stockyard, a hammer struck something metal and rang out sharp and brief. Tom Briggs picked up his bucket. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. The next hour had the quality of a thing that could break in several directions at once. Eliza reached Morrison's table first and laid the notebook open in front of him with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this specific moment for months. Morrison went through the accounts with his pen moving along the columns, his face doing the controlled professional thing that clerks did when what they were reading was considerably worse than expected, and they were not yet certain how to respond. Eliza stood across from him and explained the methodology. How she'd tracked the charges against territorial market rate records. How she'd documented each discrepancy with date and amount. How the pattern of escalation corresponded with specific events in Celine Voss's expansion of ranch holdings in the valley. She spoke for 12 minutes without notes, from memory, precisely. Morrison did not interrupt her once. June arrived at the table at the 7-minute mark and stood to Eliza's left without a word, which was not quite what the plan had called for. She was supposed to come at 12 minutes, but the look on her face when she walked up made it clear she'd seen something that had moved her timeline. What she'd seen, Colt learned 30 seconds later, was Cornelius Hartley in quiet conversation with Celine near the west entrance, with a folded document changing hands between them. June leaned toward Eliza and said something low. Eliza's expression didn't change, but her hand moved to the notebook and pressed it flat against the table with a steadiness that was almost too controlled. Morrison had seen the exchange too. His pen stopped moving. "That document," he said carefully. "The preliminary arrangement you showed me. Is that party the man in the green coat? Is that Hartley?" "Yes," June said. Morrison looked at the document he was holding. He looked at the man across the room. He set his pen down with the slow, deliberate motion of someone making a decision. "I need to ask something," he said, "and I need a direct answer." He looked at Eliza. "The young woman named as the primary party in this arrangement. She did not consent to it, and she has not been informed of it." "She was not informed," Eliza said. "She's standing right there," June said, nodding toward where Mara was now moving through the crowd, still working the stock display with no knowledge yet of what was happening at the back table. Morrison's jaw tightened slightly. He picked up a different document from his stack, an official territorial form, and began writing. Colt was on his way back from Tom Briggs when he saw Celine Voss's eyes find the clerk's table. He watched it happen in real time, the way her gaze moved through the room in its habitual survey, landed on Morrison's table, registered Eliza's presence there, registered the notebook, and then went still in the particular way of a very controlled person whose calculation has just encountered an unexpected variable. She did not look alarmed. She looked like someone who had just identified a problem and was already sorting through the solutions. She excused herself from Hartley with a light word and a hand on his arm, and she began moving toward the back of the room. Colt moved faster. He reached the clerk's table 2 seconds before she did, which was not enough of a margin, and he knew it the moment her eyes landed on him standing there. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, but a recategorization. Her eyes moved from him to Eliza, to the notebook, to Morrison's writing hand, and then back to Colt. And he could see her assembling the shape of the problem in real time. "Mr. Morrison," she said pleasantly. Her voice was the kind of smooth that took practice, warm on the surface and navigable underneath. "I wasn't aware the Ashford estate had any formal matters to file today." Morrison looked up. "Mrs. Voss." He said it without inflection. "I'm reviewing some documents related to property holdings in the valley, standard winter gathering business." "Of course." Her eyes moved to the notebook. "May I ask what documents specifically?" "Private property records. They're being submitted for territorial certification." "Under whose authority?" "Under the authority of the property holders of record," Eliza said. Celine looked at Eliza with an expression that was almost affectionate. Almost. "Eliza, dear, the property holders of record include the estate arrangements your father formalized before his death, which place the ranch holdings under my management trust." "Your management trust of the ranch operations," Eliza said, "which is a different legal instrument than title ownership, which remains shared between the three of us per the original deed." She reached into the notebook and produced a document that she laid on the table in front of Morrison. "That's the original deed, filed 1863, never superseded." A beat of silence. Celine's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes did. "And this," Eliza said, producing the betrothal document and laying it beside the deed, "is an arrangement signed by you as guardian of my sister Mara, committing her to a contractual marriage agreement with Mr. Cornelius Hartley, without her knowledge or consent." She looked directly at Celine. "We'd like Mr. Morrison to note the discrepancy between your role as described in the management trust, which does not include guardianship authority over adult women, and your role as described in this document." The room had not gone quiet, but the people nearest to the clerk's table had stopped moving. Celine's voice went down a register, not louder, quieter, which was worse. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand exactly what I'm doing," Eliza said. "I've been doing it for a year. You're going to destabilize every arrangement I've made in this valley. People's livelihoods depend on debt arrangements you manufactured," Eliza said, "which is also in the notebook." "Morrison." Celine shifted her attention to the clerk with the practiced ease of someone changing tactics mid-flow. "I'd advise you to consider carefully before certifying documents produced by parties with an obvious financial interest in Mrs. Voss." Morrison's voice was not loud, but it had found something solid in it. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back from the table." A pause. Long enough to feel like a held breath. "I beg your pardon," Celine said. "I have documents here I need to review without interruption." He met her eyes directly. I'll be happy to speak with you after I've completed my review. Step back, please. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not clean or organized, and it was not the kind of thing that looked, from the inside, like anything resembling a victory. Tom Briggs came to the table and told his story in a voice that started unsteady and got steadier as it went, and Morrison wrote down the name Henderson the notary in his official record with the careful hand of someone making sure the letters were legible. Declan Pope arrived and explained the water rights statute to Morrison in the precise, fluent language of a man who had spent 15 years in territorial records and knew exactly which statutes meant what. Whitmore himself drifted over out of curiosity and ended up standing there looking uncomfortable, which was its own kind of statement. Celine did not leave. She stood at a distance of about 10 feet and watched, and Colt watched her watching, and what he saw was a woman who was adapting, not panicking, not breaking, but shifting the game because the first configuration had been disrupted. He'd expected that. What he hadn't fully expected was Mara. She came to the table at the 15-minute mark. Nobody had sent for her. She'd come on her own, reading the shape of the gathering the way she'd learned to read everything. By the way people were moving, the clusters of attention, the careful body language of people pretending not to watch something. She came to the table and looked at the documents laid out in front of Morrison. She looked at the betrothal contract with her name on it. She stood there for a moment with her hands loose at her sides. Then she looked at Celine. It was not the look of someone about to lose control. It was something considerably harder to deal with than that. The clear, direct gaze of someone who has finally located the full shape of what was done to them and decided to stand in front of it without flinching. Celine held the gaze. She was good at that. She had been doing it for years, but the room had changed around her. Whitmore was watching. 3 other ranchers had drifted close. Morrison was writing. And the man she'd spent months keeping peripheral, the man with the creekwater eyes, and the worn gun, and the reputation she'd decided to dismiss, was standing there with a look on his face that told her, perhaps for the first time since they'd met, that he hadn't in fact been operating without a plan. "Those books go with me," Celine said suddenly. Her voice had changed, still controlled, but with something underneath it now that was doing the work that control had been covering. "They are ranch property, and therefore fall under estate management." "The books are mine," Eliza said. "I made them, on my own time, with my own materials." The records inside them document your fraud," Eliza said, "which is why you want them." Celine's 2 hired men had moved closer. Colt noticed that, and he noticed that others in the room had noticed it too. He stepped sideways casually to a position between the table and the men. He didn't make a production of it. He just stood there the way he stood places when standing there had a specific purpose that didn't need explaining. One of the men met his eyes, then looked away. Morrison looked up from his writing. He looked at the hired men. He looked at the room. He reached under the table and brought out a second territorial document, a different form entirely. "I'm issuing a temporary certification hold on the disputed documents pending circuit court review," he said, clearly enough that the people nearby could hear it. "Under territorial statute, that means these documents cannot be transferred, disposed of, or acted upon by any party until Judge Reeves reviews the certification." He stamped the form. The sound of that stamp was small, just a flat mechanical sound in a large, noisy building. But it landed in the space around the clerk's table like something considerably heavier. Celine stood there. For just a moment, not long, maybe 2 seconds, she was perfectly still in a way that had nothing of composure in it. It was the stillness of a calculation that had encountered a wall it hadn't modeled for. Then she turned and walked away through the crowd, and her hired men followed her, and the space around the clerk's table opened up like a held breath finally let go. June had been standing behind Eliza this whole time, and now she turned and found Colt's eyes, and she looked like she was going to say something and couldn't quite get there. Mara still hadn't looked away from the direction Celine had gone. "Is it over?" June asked. Declan Pope, who was folding his coat over his arm and had no particular investment in being comforting, said, "The legal part is started. Whether it's over depends on what she does next." It was the most honest answer in the room, and everyone knew it. Colt looked at the door Celine had gone through. He thought about the hired men. He thought about $900 of debt and forged papers, and a woman who had never lost without making the losing cost something. "No," he said quietly. "It's not over." and the cold that had been waiting at the edge of the day moved in a little closer. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the sky going orange and purple at the edges and the cold coming down hard from the northern ridges. Nobody talked much. The horse's breath made fog in the air, and the wagon wheels found every frozen rut in the trail, and Mara kept her eyes on the road ahead with the focused stillness of someone running a calculation that kept producing an answer she didn't like. Colt rode behind the wagon again. He was watching the tree line. He'd been watching it since they left Whitmore's stockyard. Celine had left the gathering early, before the afternoon stock sales, before the association dinner that most of the valley's ranchers would attend. That was not the behavior of a woman who had decided to accept what had happened at Morrison's table and wait for the circuit court review to play out on its own terms. Celine Voss did not absorb setbacks. She redirected them. The letter Declan Pope had written, now filed in Morrison's official records. The notebook and the betrothal document sealed under the certification hold. Tom Briggs's testimony, written and stamped. All of it had been a morning's work. Necessary, real, meaningful. And all of it was also paper, sitting in a territorial clerk's leather case, 40 miles from any judge who could act on it. Paper didn't stop men with rifles. He didn't say this to the sisters because they weren't stupid and they already knew it, and saying it out loud in the cold on a quiet trail wasn't going to accomplish anything except make the next 3 miles worse. When they got back to the ranch, June took the horses without being asked. Mara went straight into the house. Eliza stood in the yard for a moment with her arms crossed, looking at the dark tree line to the north, and then looked at Colt. "How long do you think we have?" she said. "Hard to say. She'll need to decide what move she's making. Tonight or tomorrow morning, probably. She can't come at us legally anymore, not until Reeves reviews." "No," he agreed, "not legally." Eliza looked at the house, then back at him. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to just let me say it without arguing with me at the beginning." "All right. I've been thinking about this for longer than today. Longer than last month, even." She uncrossed her arms and put her hands in her coat pockets. "Even if Reeves reviews the documents and finds in our favor, even if the debt is voided and the betrothal contract is invalidated, Celine doesn't disappear. She still has the supply contracts. She still has Holloway. She still has people in this valley who owe her and will do what she tells them because the cost of not doing it is higher than the cost of their conscience. I know. So even a legal victory doesn't end this. It starts a different version of it." "I know that too." Eliza studied him. "Then what were we doing today? Really?" He thought about that honestly. "We changed the shape of the board. Before today, she could move in any direction she wanted without cost. Now there's an official record. Now Morrison's name is attached to documents that flag her practices. Now there are people in that gathering, Whitmore, the others who were standing close, who heard things they can't unhear." He paused. "She can still come at us, but she can't do it quietly anymore. Everything she does from here is visible. Visibility doesn't protect us if she sends men tonight." "No," he said, "it doesn't." A silence. "So what do we do?" Eliza asked. "We don't sleep." He turned toward the barn. "And we get ready." Mara was in the kitchen when Colt came in from checking the outer fence line an hour later. She had a fire going and coffee on, and she was sitting at the table with a rifle across her knees, cleaning it with the automatic practiced movements of someone who'd been doing it since she was 12. She didn't look up. "Eliza told me what you two talked about." "I figured she would." "You think Celine sends men tonight?" He poured himself coffee. It was too hot, and he drank it anyway. "I think it's possible. I think we should operate like it's probable." Mara ran the cleaning rod through the barrel with a steady hand. "We've got 2 rifles, 2 shotguns, and a handgun that belonged to my father that may or may not fire reliably. The handgun misfired on me last spring. I'll look at it. There are 3 of us, and whatever you bring." She finally looked up, and there might be 4 or 5 of them. At least 3. She had 2 men at the gathering, plus the 3rd who usually works the north perimeter. Mara set the rifle down on the table. She looked at him with the direct, unadorned gaze she had when she'd run out of patience for anything except the truth. "I need to know something, and I need you to answer it straight. Go ahead. If it comes to a fight tonight, a real one, not a negotiation, not paperwork, are you going to be here or are you going to decide this is someone else's problem?" The question landed without cruelty. She wasn't accusing him of anything. She was asking because she needed to plan, and planning required knowing what resources were actually available. He put down the coffee cup. I'll be here. Why? Because I said I would. She held his gaze for a moment. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find enough of it. She picked up the rifle again. Then sit down and talk through the terrain with me, because you don't know this land as well as I do, and if we're going to defend it, we're going to do it smart. He sat down. She knew the ranch the way people knew the geography of their own hands. Without thinking, by feel, the knowledge running so deep it didn't need to surface as thought. She walked him through it in words while the fire burned low and the coffee went cold. The 3 approach routes from the main road, the sight lines from the barn roof, the shallow drainage ditch that ran along the south fence line and provided cover all the way from the pasture gate to the back of the house. They'll come from the north if they're smart, she said. The tree line gives them cover to within 200 yards of the house. If they come from the road, they're visible the whole way, and they know we'll see them. Unless they want us to see them. She considered that. A distraction. From the south, through the drainage ditch, while we're watching the north. Mara's jaw worked. That's what I'd do? Then that's what we planned for. He thought about the layout she'd drawn in his mind. June takes the north window. She'll see the road and most of the tree line from there. Eliza on the barn roof. She can see the south approach and both flanks. You and I stay mobile. June's the youngest. June is also the best shot you've told me about, and the north window is the safest position. He met her eyes. You want me to argue about who's most capable, or do you want to win? A pause. Fine. She takes the north window. You're going to hate telling her she has to stay at the window. I know. Mara almost smiled. It was a thin, tired thing, but it was real. She'll hate me telling her too. He checked the handgun, her father's, and found the misfire problem in about 4 minutes, a worn firing pin that was catching on the edge of the hammer under rapid operation. He didn't have the tools to replace it properly, but he could work it enough to be reliable on a slow, deliberate trigger pull. He told Mara that. Deliberate I can do, she said. Don't rush it, 1 shot at a time. I know how to shoot. I know you do. I'm saying it for the gun's benefit, not yours. She took the gun back from him, checked it herself, nodded. June came in from seeing to the horses, and Mara told her the plan. Colt had been right about how June would take it. She stood there with her arms crossed and her expression doing the controlled version of something considerably more forceful, and she said, The north window is where nothing happens. The north window is where everything starts, Mara said. You see them first. You tell us first. That's not nothing. It feels like nothing. It keeps us alive if you do it right. That's enough. Mara's voice had lost its arguing quality. She wasn't fighting June. She was leveling with her, and June heard the difference. I need you on that window, not because I'm protecting you, because you're steady and you'll see it before any of us will. All right? A silence. All right, June said. Not cheerful, but real. Eliza had already gone to the barn without being asked. When Colt climbed up to check on her 20 minutes later, she was lying flat on the roof ridge with her rifle propped on the peak and her coat pulled tight, scanning the south field with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for things. You've done this before, he said, coming up beside her. Not exactly this, she said, but waiting while being afraid. Yes, I've had a lot of practice. He looked out at the dark south field. The moon was coming up behind clouds, giving the land a flat, gray light that was enough to see movement but not detail. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees in the last hour. Eliza, he said. If this goes wrong tonight, if something goes wrong, get June off the property, take the horses and ride to Hattie's. Don't stay and fight for the building. She was quiet for a moment. The ranch is wooden fencing. You're not. She looked at him sideways. You're telling me to run. I'm telling you what to do if I can't hold the line and Mara can't hold the line. There's a difference. Eliza looked back out at the field. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me about tonight. I figured you'd want it. I do. She paused. What if it doesn't go wrong? Then we're all cold and tired and irritable in the morning, and that's a considerably better problem to have. She almost laughed. It came out as a breath and a small shake of her shoulders. Get off my roof, she said. I can't watch the field properly with you blocking the sight line. He climbed back down. What? They came at 2 in the morning, not from the north, not from the road. From the south, through the drainage ditch, exactly as Mara had predicted and planned for. June saw them anyway. What she saw was not the men themselves. They were low in the ditch and invisible from the north window, but the horses. 3 horses tied to the fence post at the far corner of the north pasture, standing patient and quiet in the gray moonlight, a quarter-mile from the house. She called out, low, through the internal wall of the house. Horses on the north fence. 3, nobody with them. Colt was already moving. He went out the back of the house through the kitchen door and came around the east side at a low run, staying in the shadow of the building. The cold hit him like a wall. His breath came short, his hands were already stiff, and he made himself slow down because rushing in the dark on uneven ground was how you broke an ankle and became useless. He got to the corner of the barn and stopped. The drainage ditch ran from the south pasture gate to about 30 feet east of the back of the house. From this angle, in this light, he could see the outline of the ditch's near end, the place where it opened up behind the woodpile before the ground flattened out toward the back door. He counted. 1 shape. 2. A gap, then 3. 3 men in the ditch, moving slowly, which told him they thought they were undetected and were being careful about it. No rifles up yet, hands low, moving on elbows. They hadn't reached the end of the ditch. He stepped back behind the barn wall. His heart was doing what it always did in these moments. Not pounding, exactly, but running at a different speed than normal, faster and flatter, like something that had shifted gears. He'd been here before. The specific geometry of it changed, but the essential nature of it didn't. Too many things that could go wrong, too little room for error, and the decision already made, so the only remaining question was how. He came around the north side of the barn at a full walk, not running, walking, deliberately, in the open, and he called out into the field at a volume that carried, "I see you in the ditch. All 3 of you. Stand up." Silence. The sound of the wind in the dry grass. "I'm not going to chase you through a ditch in the dark, but the woman on the barn roof has a clear angle on the near end, and she's better with a rifle than I am. So you've got about 15 seconds to think about what Celine Voss is paying you versus what you're about to walk into." More silence. Then, from the ditch, a voice Colt didn't recognize. She said the place would be empty. She was wrong. He kept his voice flat. Informational. "You want to keep going on somebody else's bad information? That's your choice. But you'll want to make it in the next 10 seconds. A sound of movement in the ditch. Then a head came up over the edge. One of Celine's hired men, the one who'd walked the perimeter at the Tuesday visits. He looked at Colt. He looked at the barn roof where Eliza was lying invisible in the dark. He looked at the house where lamplight showed in the north window. "There's nothing here worth dying over," Colt said. "Go home." The man in the ditch looked at his companions. Something passed between them in the dark. The particular arithmetic of men who are hired rather than invested, working through what they were actually willing to do, and for what price. The man stood up. The other 2 stood up a moment later. They were not gunfighters. They were ranch hands who'd been given a job that had just gotten considerably more complicated than presented. Standing in a ditch in the middle of the night, looking up at a man who had killed people and was using the kind of voice that indicated he'd already decided where his lines were. That was not what any of them had agreed to when they took Celine's money. "Leave the way you came," Colt said. "Slow." They left. He stood in the cold and watched them until the shapes were gone into the dark, and then he kept standing there a while longer because men who left sometimes came back, and he'd learned that lesson the hard way. Mara came around the side of the house after about 5 minutes. She had the rifle in her hand and she stood beside him, looking at the dark south pasture. "They're gone?" she asked. "For now." "Will they come back?" "Not tonight. She'll need to decide what to do with the fact that didn't work." Mara was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass, and the horses shifted in the barn, and somewhere in the upper field a coyote went off and went silent. "That was almost too easy," she said. "I know. That worries me more than if it had been hard." He nodded. "Me too." She stood there a moment longer, then went back inside. He heard the door close. He heard June's voice through the wall, asking something, and Mara answering. He heard the low sound of Eliza coming down off the barn roof and landing in the yard. He looked at the dark tree line to the north. Celine Voss had not built what she'd built by sending 3 ranch hands down a ditch and calling it a plan. Tonight had been a test of their alertness, of their defensiveness, of whether they would panic or hold. They had held. But he knew the way you knew things when you'd been around enough trouble to read its grammar, that a woman like Celine didn't test once and accept the result. She tested to find weaknesses, and if tonight hadn't found one, she'd look elsewhere. He thought about Morrison's leather case, about the documents inside it, about 40 miles of road between the documents and a judge who hadn't reviewed them yet. He thought about all the ways a leather case could fail to arrive. He rode to Red Hollow before sunrise. He didn't tell the sisters. He left a note on the kitchen table that said went to town, back by noon, which was honest as far as it went and incomplete in the ways that mattered. But he didn't have a better option that didn't involve a conversation that would cost him an hour he didn't have. The road was hard with frost and the roan moved fast on it, glad of the work. He made the town in 40 minutes and went straight to Hattie's. She answered the door in her robe with a lamp and the expression of a woman who had been woken before sunrise before and had opinions about it. When she saw his face, she stood back and let him in without a word. He told her what had happened, the gathering, the certification hold, the men in the ditch. Hattie stood in her kitchen and listened with the focused attention of a woman assembling a picture piece by piece, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "Morrison," she said, "he'll need to protect those documents. That's why I'm here. I need someone to ride to the county seat today and get word to Reeves's office directly. Not through the mail, not through any intermediary that Celine has access to. Someone Celine doesn't have a line on." Hattie looked at him. "You're asking me." "I'm asking if you know someone who can make the ride and deliver the message." A pause. Hattie set down her lamp and crossed her arms and thought. "My nephew," she said. "He's 19, he rides well, and he's never done a day's business with Celine Voss in his life because he only arrived in the valley 8 months ago from Missouri. Can he leave today?" "He can leave in an hour if I ask him." Colt pulled the folded paper from his coat, the letter he'd written by lamplight while the house was sleeping, before he'd saddled the horse. He'd written it in plain, specific language, what was in Morrison's case, the certification hold, the documents, the request that the circuit review be expedited given the active threat to the involved parties. He put it on Hattie's kitchen table. "He needs to put that in Reeves's clerk's hand," Colt said. "Not leave it with a secretary, not send it ahead, hand to hand." Hattie looked at the letter. She looked at him. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "You've been doing this kind of thing, not the ranching, this, moving pieces." "I've known people who abuse their position," he said. "I've seen how it ends when good people wait for it to fix itself." Hattie nodded slowly. "I'll get my nephew up." He stood up from the table. "There's one more thing. The men Celine's been using, 3 of them are hers, but there may be more if she decides to escalate. I need to know if she's brought in anyone new to the valley, strangers, men who look like hired work rather than ranch work. I'll put my ears out. Today if you can." "I know how urgency works," Hattie said, not unkindly. She was already moving toward the stairs. "You should eat something before you ride back. There's cornbread on the shelf." He ate standing at the kitchen counter. It was cold cornbread from the day before and it was fine. He wasn't tasting it anyway. By the time he stepped back outside, the sky had gone from black to the deep, bruised blue of early winter morning, and the town was starting to make its first sounds. A door somewhere, a horse, the distant metallic clang of the smithy starting its fire. He untied the roan and stood there a moment. He thought about what Eliza had said. Even a legal victory doesn't end this. She was right. And he had known she was right before she said it. What he hadn't said back to her, what he hadn't said to any of them, was what he actually believed about how this ended. Not in the clean way, not in the legal way. This ended when Celine Voss ran out of moves and knew it, and that hadn't happened yet. He got on the horse and rode back toward the ranch in the cold blue morning, and the frost cracked under the roan's hooves the whole way, sharp and clean and precise as the sound of something waiting to break. I was 3 miles out when he saw the smoke. It was a thin column, pale gray against the pale sky, rising from somewhere in the direction of the ranch. Not the black, rolling smoke of a building fire. Thin. Controlled. The kind of smoke that came from a fire that had been set and managed. He put his heels to the horse. The south pasture fence was burning. Not the barn, not the house. The fence line along the southern boundary, the long stretch of new posts and wire he had spent 3 days mending in his first week at the ranch. It burned in a line from the gate to the first corner post, controlled enough not to spread in the frozen grass, but deliberate enough to send a message that required no translation. Mara and June were already there with blankets and a bucket line from the stock trough. The fire was out by the time Colt rode up, but the fence was gone. 100 yards of work reduced to charred posts and sagging wire, and the south pasture open to the road. Mara turned when she heard his horse. Her face was covered in soot, and her eyes were bright with the particular fury of someone who is beyond surprise and operating entirely on forward motion. "It was set," she said. "From the roadside. They didn't come back onto the property." "No," he said. "They didn't need to." June was standing in the burned section with a blanket over her shoulders and ash in her hair. She looked at the open gap where the fence had been and said, with a flatness that carried more weight than anger would have, "She's telling us the certification hold doesn't change what she can do." "Yes," Colt said. "She's right, isn't she?" He looked at the open fence line. He looked at the road beyond it. He thought about Hattie's nephew riding south with a letter, and about how long a ride that was, and about how many things could happen between now and whenever Judge Reeves found time to review a territorial certification hold from a valley most people in the capital had never thought twice about. "She's right that the hold doesn't stop her from making our lives difficult," he said. "She's wrong about what it means." "What does it mean?" June asked. He got down off the horse. "It means she's scared enough to start burning fences instead of waiting." He looked at Mara. "A woman who's winning doesn't do this. She does this because we took something from her yesterday that she can't get back. The invisibility. The assumption that nobody was watching." Mara looked at the burned fence line. Something in her face moved through the anger and came out the other side into something more focused. "Help me start pulling the charred posts," she said. "We've got stock that'll wander through that gap before noon if we don't get it closed." He tied the horse to the fence rail and started pulling posts. The work was hard and cold, and his hands were already stiff from the ride, and the ash got into everything, and none of it was elegant or meaningful looking. Just two people doing necessary work in the aftermath of something that had been designed to feel like defeat. He didn't feel defeated. He felt the shape of the next move clarifying the way it sometimes did, not as a plan exactly, but as a direction. Celine had come out into the open. The fence proved it. She was pushing because she knew the clock was running, and she needed a resolution before Reeves's review changed the legal landscape permanently. That meant she was going to push harder, and harder meant something that hadn't happened yet. He kept pulling posts. The sky got lighter. The smoke smell stayed in the air, thin and persistent, the smell of something that had been solid and was now gone. And somewhere down the road the roan shifted its weight, and the frozen ground cracked under its hooves, and the day that was coming didn't look like anything easy. But it was the day they had, and they were in it. They finished the fence repair in silence that lasted longer than comfortable and shorter than permanent. By the time the last post was tamped down and the wire strung back across the gap, the morning had gone gray with cloud cover, and Colt's hands had stopped being cold and started simply being numb, which was its own kind of functional. June brought water from the stock trough, and they drank without ceremony, standing in the ash-smelling air of the south pasture. Mara looked at the repaired section with the critical eye of someone who knew it wasn't as good as what had been there before and was deciding whether to say so. She didn't say so. That was its own form of progress. They were walking back toward the house when the rider appeared on the main road. Not one of Celine's men. A single figure on a bay horse, moving at a trot, no visible weapons, and the posture of someone coming with a purpose rather than a threat. Colt made these assessments in the time it took him to stop walking and turn, and then he recognized the horse before he recognized the rider. It was Tom Briggs. He came off the road and up the trail at a reduced pace, and he looked like a man who had not slept and had been arguing with himself about something for the entire ride over. He pulled up about 20 feet out, looked at the three of them, and then looked at Colt specifically. "I need to talk to you," he said. "You can talk to all of us," Mara said, before Colt could answer. Tom looked at her. He had the expression of a young man who was about to say something he'd rather not say, which in Colt's experience usually meant it was something that needed saying. "She let me go last night," Tom said. "After the gathering. Told me to clear my things off the property before morning." Nobody spoke. "I figured that was coming," Tom continued, "after what I said to Morrison. I knew it was coming when I said it." He was talking faster than he needed to, the speed of someone trying to get through the uncomfortable part. "But before she let me go, I heard something. She was talking to the two remaining hands, the ones who came here last night, and I was in the barn and she didn't know I was there." "What did you hear?" Eliza asked. Tom looked down at his saddle horn for a moment, then back up. She's not waiting for the circuit review. She's going around it. She sent a telegram to Holloway last night, Judge Holloway, requesting an emergency injunction against the certification hold on the basis that the documents were obtained under duress. He paused. And she's got 2 men coming in from outside the valley, not her regular hands, different men. The cold that was already in the air seemed to sharpen itself. When? Colt said. Today, I think. She said before nightfall. A silence fell over the group that had a different quality than the earlier quiet. This one had weight to it, the weight of a situation that had just moved faster than anticipated. Colt looked at Mara. Mara looked back at him. How reliable is Holloway to issue that injunction? Eliza asked Tom. Her voice was precise and controlled, and you could see her already calculating. He's done everything she's asked for 4 years, Tom said flatly, so pretty reliable. If the injunction voids the certification hold, Eliza began. The documents lose their protected status, Colt finished. She can demand them returned as contested property. And Morrison would have to comply, Eliza said. He's a clerk. He doesn't have the standing to fight a sitting judge's order. Mara had stopped walking. She was standing in the middle of the yard with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was angry enough that she'd pass through it into something tactical. Then we need to get ahead of Holloway, she said. How? June asked. The injunction has to be filed and served. That takes time, even for Holloway. If Morrison receives word from Reeves's office before the injunction lands, Reeves's office doesn't know the timeline has changed, Colt said. Everyone looked at him. He thought about Hattie's nephew riding south with the letter. He thought about the timeline of that ride. A full day at least to the county seat, assuming good road conditions, which the winter didn't guarantee. I need to go back to town, he said. You were just in town, June said. I need to send a telegram. Celine controls the telegram office, Tom said. Whitmore owes her the credit on his supply contract. She'll know what you send within an hour of you sending it. Colt stopped. That was the problem laid out plain. Every conventional channel had been compromised before they needed it. The telegram office, the local judge, the supply lines, all of it ran through Celine's arrangements in one form or another. She hadn't built that network by accident. She'd built it specifically for a moment like this one, when someone decided to push back and she needed to close every door simultaneously. Tom Briggs was still sitting on his horse. He'd said what he came to say, and now he had the look of a man unsure of his next move, which was understandable given that he'd just burned his employment, his housing, and whatever goodwill Celine had extended him, all on a morning that wasn't getting simpler. You got somewhere to go? Colt asked him. Tom shook his head. Not locally. Colt looked at Mara. Mara looked at Tom with the assessing gaze she gave everything. Tom had testified against Celine at Morrison's table. He'd ridden out here at first light with information he didn't have to share. He was 20 years old and had the look of someone who'd made a decision and was now living in the full cost of it. Unsaddle your horse, Mara said. Put it in the near pen. You can sleep in the barn. Tom blinked. You don't have to. I know I don't. Unsaddle your horse. He got down and led the bay toward the pen without further argument. What? The telegram problem sat in the middle of the kitchen table like a physical object while they drank coffee and talked through it. The directness of the challenge had a clarifying effect. There was no longer any ambiguity about what Celine was doing or what the timeline was. The question was purely logistical. There's a telegraph relay station at the Dunbar County line, Eliza said. It's a secondary line that runs to the county seat for the Railroad Survey Office, not connected to Whitmore's main office. How far? Colt asked. 16 miles, maybe 17. Who runs it? A man named Garrett. He's a railroad surveyor. He has no connection to Celine's supply arrangements because he doesn't operate a ranch or a store. He works for the railroad company directly. Colt looked at her. You've been sitting on this. I've been cataloging options for 18 months, Eliza said, without apology. I didn't know when I'd need them. Can you write the telegram? I already have. She reached into her coat and produced a folded paper. She'd written it at the kitchen table sometime in the last 20 minutes, while Colt and Mara were still working the fence. It was addressed to the office of the Circuit Court, attention Judge Reeves, and it was written in the compressed, specific language of someone who understood that telegraph lines charged by the word and that every word needed to carry weight. Colt read it. It was good, precise, factual, urgent without being dramatic. It named the certification hold, the documents, the threat of Holloway's injunction, and requested expedited review. This gets to Reeves before Holloway's order lands, he said, and Reeves has the standing to supersede a county judge on territorial matters. Yes, Eliza said. Who's riding it to Garrett's station? I'll go, June said. No, Mara said, at the same moment that Eliza said, June. June looked between her sisters. I'm the fastest rider in this family, and everyone knows it. She's right, Eliza said to Mara, with the tone of someone who doesn't enjoy being right about this particular thing. Mara's expression went through a brief, complicated journey. The men Celine's bringing in won't be here until tonight. Tom said before nightfall. It's not yet 9 in the morning. June looked at Colt. How long is the ride? 3 hours there and back in good conditions. I'll be back before noon. She looked at Mara. It's 16 miles of road, not a gunfight. I can do 16 miles of road. Mara sat with it for a moment longer than was comfortable, which was the honest version of what she was feeling rather than the easy version. Then she said, Take the gray. She's faster on frozen ground than the bay. She looked at Juno with an expression that was trying to be only practical and not quite managing it. You ride straight. You don't stop for anything that looks wrong. Anything. I know, June said. I mean it. Mara. June put a hand briefly on her sister's arm. I know. She left within 10 minutes, and the sound of the gray mare's hooves on the frozen trail faded out faster than Colt expected, and then the yard was quiet. The waiting was the hard part. It was always the hard part. Colt used the time the way he used most waiting, by working. He went over the defensive position again, this time with Tom Briggs, who knew the terrain around Celine's property and could give information about the kind of men she'd be bringing in. Tom described them in the careful, reluctant way of someone describing a thing they wished they hadn't witnessed. 2 men she'd used before, a year ago, when a rancher in the North Valley had refused to sell and needed convincing. The rancher had sold. Tom didn't know what form the convincing had taken and had not asked. Rifles, Colt asked. One of them, yes. The other one, Tom hesitated. He doesn't use a rifle. He gets closer than that. Colt processed that. How many times have you seen her use men like this? Twice that I know about directly. Probably more I don't. And nobody said anything. Tom was quiet for a moment. He was sitting on an upturned bucket in the barn, his coat still on, looking at the ground in the particular way of someone examining their own history and finding the view uncomfortable. People said things to each other, not publicly, not officially. He paused. When you're a 20-year-old hand on somebody's payroll and you see something you shouldn't have, and the person you'd report it to is either afraid of her or on her side, you do the math on what reporting it costs you, and you keep your head down. Until you don't, Colt said. Until you don't, Tom agreed. There was a silence. Then Tom looked up. Is that what you did? Kept your head down until you didn't? Colt thought about that. About a prison outside Flagstaff and a marshal who'd turned out to be something else, and a series of decisions that had looked at each individual step, like the practical thing. I kept my head down for a long time, he said, and it didn't make me feel the way I thought it would. Tom nodded slowly, like that was an answer he recognized. Mara found him at the north fence line around mid-morning, checking the sight lines from the high point on the ridge above the pasture. She climbed up beside him and looked out at the road below. Visible for about half a mile in both directions from here, the best vantage point on the property. Eliza's been going through the account books again, she said. She found something. What? The debt arrangement Celine has with the other ranchers in the valley, the ones we thought were just supply credit. Some of them are structured the same way ours is, fees that compound, charges that don't correspond to market rates, penalties triggered by provisions that aren't in the original contracts. She paused. She's been doing this to multiple families, not just us. Colt looked at the road. Whitmore's probably the most visible one, Mara continued. But there's also the Hendersons at the north end, the Cray family, the Pearsons, who everyone thinks are doing fine because they never complain. Eliza thinks if she looked at all of them, she'd find the same pattern. Morrison can't certify those documents. They're not before him. No. But if Reeves reviews ours and finds fraud, real, documented fraud, the pattern becomes relevant. A circuit judge with evidence of systematic fraud across multiple families has considerably more authority to act than one reviewing a single property dispute. He looked at her. She was looking at the road with the focused intelligence that he'd learned to recognize as Mara thinking several moves ahead and presenting the conclusion rather than the process. "You want Eliza to contact the other families," he said. "I want Eliza to document what she found, today. Before tonight, in case—" She stopped. "In case what?" "In case tonight doesn't go the way we plan." Her voice was flat and deliberate. Not afraid exactly, realistic in the way of people who have been counting on things and having them go sideways long enough to factor it into the calculation. If something happens to us and the documents still exist and reach Reeves, that matters. That changes things for those other families even if it doesn't change things for us. Colt was quiet for a moment. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said. Mara looked at him with an expression that was almost patient. "I appreciate that. But that's not a plan. It's a sentiment. I need a plan." She was right, and he knew it. "All right," he said. "Eliza documents what she found, and we get it to Morrison before tonight. She can ride to town herself. She knows the way, and she's not June, who Celine's men might be watching for. And if Holloway's injunction lands while she's there, Morrison won't surrender the documents without serving us notice first. That's territorial procedure. It buys a few hours." He looked at the road again. "Long enough for Eliza to add the supplementary documentation to the record." Mara nodded. She was already organizing the logistics of it in her head. You could see it happening, the quick, systematic sorting that characterized how she operated when the variables were clear and the need was urgent. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "I want to apologize to you." He looked at her. "Not for this morning. For before. The first week you were here, I was—" She stopped, reconsidered, started again. "I spent 4 years watching people offer to help and then do their math and leave. So I learned to treat offers of help like opening bids in a negotiation. Assume the real price is coming, figure out how to avoid paying it." "That was a reasonable thing to learn," he said. "Maybe. But I treated you like a variable I needed to control before you showed your real purpose." She looked at him directly. "You've been here 2 months, and I still don't fully understand why, and that bothers me less than it used to. Which means something shifted." She paused. "I'm not good at saying this kind of thing." "You're doing fine," he said. She almost smiled. The same thin, real thing from 2 nights ago in the kitchen. "Don't patronize me." "I'm not. You're doing fine." She stood up from the fence rail. "Eliza's going to town. I'm going to check the East stock. You should eat something. Hattie's cornbread that you took this morning doesn't count as a meal." She walked back down toward the house. He stood on the ridge for a while longer, looking at the road, and felt the day tilting toward evening in the way that days in December did. Too fast, the light going low and amber, and then gone before you'd made your peace with it. What? Eliza came back from town at 2 in the afternoon with confirmation that Morrison had received the supplementary documents and logged them under the existing certification hold number, and also with news that Holloway's office had indeed filed the injunction request that morning. "Morrison has until tomorrow morning to respond," Eliza said. She was unwinding her scarf in the doorway, her cheeks red from the cold. "He said he'll cite territorial precedent on supplementary evidence and request a stay. He's not certain it'll hold." "Will it hold until Reeves can act?" Colt asked. "He thinks so." "Maybe. If Reeves received the telegraph and moves quickly." She looked at him. "That's a lot of conditionals." "I know." "June's not back yet," Mara said from across the room. Everyone looked at the window. It was past 2. June had left before 9. The ride was 3 hours there and back under good conditions. Under good conditions. Colt moved to the window without making a production of it. The road was visible from the front of the house for about a quarter mile, empty in both directions. "She probably had to wait for Garrett," Eliza said. "If he wasn't at the station when she arrived." "She'd wait," Mara agreed. Her voice was even. Her hands were not entirely still. They waited. Tom Briggs appeared in the kitchen doorway and took in the room's atmosphere with the perceptive instinct of someone who had gotten good at reading when a situation was changing quality. He said nothing and poured himself coffee and stood near the far wall, which was, Colt thought, about the most useful thing he could do. At 2:47, they heard hoofbeats on the road. Mara was at the door before anyone else moved. June came up the trail at a canter on the gray mare, which was blowing from the pace but moving clean, and June herself looked tired and cold and entirely intact, and when she got close enough to see their faces in the doorway, she called out, I'm fine, before she'd even stopped the horse, which told Colt she'd seen the expression on Mara's face from 30 feet out. She came inside and drank 2 cups of water standing at the kitchen counter before she said anything useful. Garrett sent it, she said. He read it twice to make sure I had the address right, and he sent it. He said the county seat line has been reliable all week. Did he ask questions? Eliza asked. Some. I told him it was a property matter and that it was urgent. June set down the cup. He seemed like a decent man. He didn't charge me. A collective breath released in the room. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the small physical adjustment of people who have been operating on held tension for several hours. Mara crossed the kitchen and put her hands briefly on June's shoulders. She didn't say anything. June leaned into it for about 2 seconds, then straightened up. What did I miss? June asked. Eliza went to Morrison. Holloway filed the injunction. We're waiting on Reeves. Mara dropped her hands. And Celine's men are due before nightfall. June looked out the window. The light was already dropping, the December afternoon burning down fast. Then we should eat something real before it gets dark, June said. I'm serious. Cornbread doesn't count. She looked at Colt when she said that last part. He had no idea how she knew about the cornbread. What? They ate at 4. Salt pork and beans and bread that June made in 40 minutes with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been feeding a household since she was 13. It was not a quiet meal, but the conversation was the mundane, practical kind that people have when they are making themselves normal in the face of something that isn't. Tom describing a ranch he'd worked in New Mexico before Red Hollow. Eliza asking Colt a question about cattle pricing in the Southern Territory that he mostly knew the answer to. June eating with the same focused completeness as always. Mara didn't eat much. She sat at the table and contributed to the conversation at the appropriate intervals, and kept her eyes moving to the window at the kind of regular frequency that she was trying not to make obvious. When the meal was done and the plates cleared, the light outside had gone to gray and the temperature had dropped another notch, and the wind had picked up from the north, which it sometimes did before weather came through. Colt stood at the window for a long time. He thought about 2 men coming in from outside the valley, one with a rifle, one who got closer than that. He thought about the documents in Morrison's case and the telegram at Garrett's station, and the slow, grinding machinery of territorial law making its way toward a decision. He thought about the specific, practical gap between what the law could do and what the next 12 hours could do, and how that gap was the place where everything either held or didn't. Tom, he said. Tom looked up from where he was sitting. You ever work a night watch? Some. North fence line, high point on the ridge, same place I showed you this morning. You can see the road from both directions up there. You see movement, you come straight back. You don't engage. Tom nodded. All right. Eliza, barn roof, she said. Same as before. June, north window. Yes, June said. No argument this time. He looked at Mara last. She was already standing. You and me stay mobile, she said, before he could say it. Yes. She looked at him with an expression that had moved past the specific fear of the last 12 hours into something more settled. Not peace, nothing like peace, but the particular steadiness of a person who has accounted for the worst possibility and decided to keep going anyway. Whatever happens tonight, she said, these are our walls. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a declaration to anybody in particular. It was just the truth of the thing, stated plainly, the way she stated most things. Yes, he said. The dark came down fast after that, the way it did in December, and the wind moved through the dry grass of the south pasture and found every gap in the barn boards, and somewhere out past the tree line on the north road, whatever was coming was already on its way. They heard the horses at 8:15. Not from the ditch this time, not careful or concealed. They came up the main road and turned onto the ranch trail without slowing, and there were more than 2 of them. Colt counted 4 horses by sound before Tom's voice came down from the ridge in a low carrying call. 4 riders, coming up the trail direct. Direct. In the open. Not hiding. That was a different kind of message than the men in the ditch. That was Celine saying, I'm done with quiet. Colt looked at Mara. Mara looked back at him and her jaw was set, and her hands were steady on the rifle, and she had the look of a woman who had been waiting 4 years for the version of this moment where she didn't have to keep taking what was handed to her. All right, she said quietly. Let's go. The 4 riders came up the trail without hurry, which was the thing that made it worse. Hurry implied a kind of recklessness that could be turned against itself. This was deliberate, the pace of people who had accounted for opposition and decided it didn't change the math. Colt and Mara positioned themselves at the edge of the yard, in the space between the house and the barn, where the lamplight from the front window reached the ground and made them visible. That was intentional. Standing in the light instead of the dark was a choice. It said, "We see you coming and we're not hiding from it," which was a different posture than the ditch from 2 nights ago. And posture mattered in these moments more than most people understood until they were standing in one. The riders stopped at the edge of the yard. 4 of them, as Tom had counted. 2 were the men Colt recognized from Celine's regular visits, the perimeter walker, the one who'd stood up from the ditch. The other 2 were different. The first was a tall man on a black horse with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to conserve everything until it was needed. The second was broader, shorter, with no rifle visible, and he sat his horse close to the others in a way that suggested he preferred proximity to distance. The one who gets closer than that. Colt kept his hands loose and his eyes moving between all 4 of them. Then Celine's wagon came up behind the riders. He hadn't heard it because the wind was wrong, and because he'd been listening for what Tom had described, 4 horses, and had filed the wagon sound under something else without thinking. That was a mistake. He noted it, filed it, kept his face still. Celine stepped down from the wagon without assistance and walked through the gap between her riders with the unhurried ease of a woman arriving at a meeting she had called. She wore a heavy coat against the cold, and she carried nothing in her hands, which told you that she wasn't here to do any physical work herself. She stopped about 15 feet from where Colt and Mara were standing. She looked at Mara first, then at Colt, then at the house, the barn, the yard, cataloging. "Where are the other 2?" she said. "Around," Mara said. Celine nodded once, as if that was the answer she'd expected. "I want to resolve this tonight," she said. "I'm not interested in prolonging it." "Then leave," Mara said. Celine's expression didn't change. "The injunction was filed this morning. By tomorrow, Morrison will be required to surrender the documents. The certification hold becomes void." She looked at Mara with something that was almost compassionate in its delivery and nothing like compassionate in its substance. "Everything you did at the gathering, the notebook, the testimony, it falls apart under a county judge's order. You know that." "Reeves supersedes Holloway," Eliza's voice came from the dark above the barn. Celine's eyes moved upward briefly. "On territorial matters, the circuit court has primacy. You know that too." "If Reeves acts," Celine said, "which requires him to receive notice, review the documentation, and issue a counter-order before Holloway's injunction is served, that's a sequence of events that requires time." She paused. "Time is what you don't have." "We sent a telegram," June's voice came from the north window. Celine looked at the house. Something moved in her face. A small recalculation, quickly done. "Through Whitmore's office." "Through Garrett's station at the county line," Colt said. A silence. This one was different from the earlier silences. This one had the quality of a machine hitting an unexpected resistance. Not stopping, not breaking, but changing the sound it made. Celine looked at Colt. For the first time in the 2 months he'd been aware of her existence, she looked at him without the measuring calculation that was her default expression. What replaced it, just for a moment, was something more direct. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of one careful person identifying another. "You've been busy," she said. "So have you," he said. She looked at the burned south fence line, visible at the edge of the lamplight, then back at him. "That was meant to communicate a point, not cause permanent damage." "It caused damage," Mara said flatly. "Permanent or not." Celine turned back to Mara. When she spoke again, the compassion-adjacent quality was gone, and what was left was just the arithmetic. "I'll offer you this once. Sign over the management trust permanently. Full operational control, no reversionary clause, and I withdraw the injunction and restructure the debt as a 10-year note at fixed rate. You keep living here. You keep working it. The financial pressure stops." The yard was very quiet. Colt could hear the wind in the fence posts and the horses breathing, and somewhere in the dark field, an animal moving through dry grass. Mara didn't look at him. She didn't look at the riders. She looked at Celine with the full, clear gaze of a woman who had been offered versions of this deal for 4 years in smaller increments and had finally arrived at the place where the full shape of it was visible. "You want us to sign the ranch over to you," Mara said, "and you'll let us stay on it as your labor." "I want to end the legal dispute. That's what you want," Mara said. Say it straight. Celine was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. That's what I want. No, Mara said. One word, no heat in it, just the plain final sound of a door being closed. Celine looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the tall man on the black horse and gave a small nod. Colt had been watching for it. He stepped left and called up to Eliza in the same motion. South flank. He said it the way you said things when you needed them done immediately, and he heard Eliza shift on the barn roof before the word was fully out. The tall man had started to move his horse forward. He stopped when he registered Colt's position change, not because it was threatening in itself, but because it was precise, and precise movement in the dark from a man with Colt's specific reputation had a clarifying effect. Before you do what she just told you to do, Colt said, I want you to think about something. The tall man looked at him. There's a circuit court certification hold on documents that include the names of everyone in this yard tonight. Morrison has those records. They don't disappear if something happens here. They get more important. He let that land. And there's a telegram at the county seat that describes the situation at this ranch in enough detail that if this goes badly tonight, there will be questions that don't stop. The tall man said nothing, but he hadn't moved again. She's paying you, Colt said. She's not paying you enough for what those questions will look like. The broader man, the one without the rifle, had moved his horse around the edge of the group, slowly, using the conversation as cover. Mara saw it before Colt did, which was something he would think about later as evidence of how well she understood the terrain of her own yard. She turned to face him and raised the rifle in one motion. Stop there. He stopped. The yard held in a configuration that was neither resolved nor broken, a standoff with too many moving pieces and not enough space between them, the kind of situation that could go 3 different directions in the next 30 seconds, depending on who made the first bad decision. It was Tom Briggs who broke it. He came down from the ridge at a run, not the careful, quiet return Colt had told him to make, but fast, skidding on the frozen ground, and he called out before he fully reached the yard. Rider coming, from the south road, fast. Everyone looked at him. Single rider, Tom said, breathing hard. Coming hard. Not Celine's people, different horse. A pause of about 4 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then the hoofbeats were audible to everyone, coming from the south, fast and clean on the frozen road, and the horse that appeared at the trail entrance was lathered and blowing, and the rider on it was young, maybe 20, with the look of someone who had been riding hard for a long time and had one job left to do. He pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked around at the assembled scene. The riders, the wagon, Mara with the rifle, Colt with the specific positioning of someone mid-standoff. And he did not appear as surprised by it as he probably should have been. I'm looking for whoever sent the telegraph from Garrett's station, he said. That's us, Colt said. The rider reached into his coat and produced an envelope. Judge Reeves's clerk. He rode through the night to get ahead of the county injunction. The judge reviewed the certification documents this morning when the first letter arrived and the telegraph confirmed the timeline. He held out the envelope. That's a circuit court order staying all county-level injunctions against the certification hold pending full territorial review. It's dated today and it's signed. The yard was completely still. Colt walked to the rider and took the envelope. He opened it. He read it. The language was formal and dense in the way of legal documents, but the substance was clear. Reeves had acted. The hold was protected. Holloway's injunction had no force. He looked up at Celine. She was looking at the envelope in his hands with an expression he had not seen on her face in any of the times he'd observed her. Not the calculator's assessment, not the managed warmth, not the hard arithmetic of someone who had learned to operate without visible tells. She looked like someone who had just understood for the first time that the ground she'd been standing on was not as solid as she'd built her life on. Mara had crossed the yard and read over Colt's shoulder. She straightened up. You heard him, she said to Celine. The hold stands. Your injunction is stayed. The documents go to Reeves for full review. Her voice was even. Not triumphant. She wasn't built for triumphant, and this moment didn't feel triumphant to anyone standing in it. It felt cold and hard and real. Take your men and go. Celine stood there. Mara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fence he was working, which was not the most interesting thing in the yard, and he knew she hadn't come out here to look at fence. You're thinking about leaving, she said. He kept his hands on the wire. I've been thinking about a lot of things. You don't have to be diplomatic about it. You came here for cattle work and ended up in something considerably more complicated. You don't owe us permanence. I know I don't. But, she said. He looked up. She was watching him with the direct, patient attention she gave things when she'd decided to wait for the honest answer, instead of the easy one. I don't know what I'm owed or what I owe, he said. I've spent a long time not knowing, operating in the space between jobs, between towns, between... He stopped. Started again differently. You build a life around not needing things, and you get good at it. And then something shifts and you realize that what you've been calling independence is just distance with a different name. Mara looked at him. That's more than I meant to say, he said. I know. She looked back at the fence. June thinks you should stay. She said it directly to me yesterday, which is June's way of saying she's thought about it long enough to be certain. What does Eliza think? Eliza thinks you have useful skills and that the spring calving will need experienced hands. A pause. Which is Eliza's way of saying she thinks you should stay. And you? Mara was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet, the other kind, the one she reserved for things she was taking seriously enough to get right. I think this ranch needs to be the Ashford Ranch, she said. Not the ranch where a man who helped us once lives out of obligation. Not the ranch that owes you something, so you stay to collect it. I've had enough of that dynamic to last my life. That's not why I'd stay. I know. I'm telling you what it can't be. What it can be... She turned and looked at him with the full directness that was the most characteristically Mara thing about her. Something honest. Something that starts at zero, without debt on either side. If that's a thing you want, it's here. She paused. The north fence still needs another 40 yards before the spring thaw. She walked back toward the house. He stood in the cold with the wire in his hands and looked at the fence stretching out ahead of him. 40 yards of it, give or take, running straight across the frozen ground toward the ridge. He thought about $62 and a bad horseshoe. He thought about a private trail he'd ridden up on a half-believed lie. He thought about prison outside Flagstaff and a marshal who'd turned out to be something else, and all the long miles in between, and how the miles looked different depending on which direction you were facing when you counted them. He pulled the wire taut and drove the next staple, then the next one. Eliza found him at the far end of the fence line at noon, with a plate of food and the practical manner of someone delivering supplies rather than sentiment, which was how Eliza delivered most things she cared about. She set the plate on the top fence rail and looked at the work he'd done. 40 yards, she said. Close enough. She looked at the fence the way she looked at the account books, checking for errors, assessing the structural integrity, deciding whether it would hold. It'll hold, she said. That's the idea. She picked up the empty coffee cup he'd left on the post and held it, looking out at the ridge. I've been thinking about something, she said. Usually are. The other families in the valley, the ones whose arrangements were flagged. She turned the cup in her hands. They're going to need help understanding the legal process, the filings, the supplementary complaints, what the circuit review means for them practically. She looked at him. Declan Pope knows the statutes, but he needs someone to organize the effort, someone who can talk to people who are afraid and make them believe it's worth the risk. You'd be good at that, Colt said. I'd be good at the paperwork. I'm not good at making frightened people feel safe enough to act. She looked at him directly. You are. He didn't answer immediately. I'm not asking you to do it for free, Eliza said, with the matter-of-fact practicality that was her version of warmth. The ranch will pay what it can, which isn't much right now. But Reeves's findings open doors that weren't open before, and if we can get the other families to file properly, the territory has to notice the pattern. A pattern changes the scale of what Celine answers for in the spring. He looked out at the ridge. You've been building this for a while. I've been building a lot of things for a while, she said. It wasn't pride, just fact. It's how I operate. He thought about what she was describing. Not a quick intervention, not a riding into town moment, but the slower, harder work of helping people navigate a system that had been set against them. The kind of work that didn't look like anything from the outside. No standoffs, no dramatic confrontations in stockyards. Just documents and conversations and the grinding effort of making something function the way it was supposed to. The 40 yards of fence, he said. Eliza looked at him. Mara told me this morning. Eliza's expression shifted slightly. The faint, brief warmth that was her version of a smile. She told you in her way, she said. I'm telling you in mine. She picked up the plate and handed it to him. Eat. The afternoon wire isn't going to string itself. She walked back toward the house, and the cold came in behind her, and the ridge was brown and gray and still in the winter light. June found him at dusk, which was when she usually found him, because June had a sense for the end of the day's work the same way she had a sense for most things, instinctively, without making a project of it. She climbed up and sat on the top fence rail the way she'd done a dozen times before, with the casual, boneless ease of someone who'd been climbing fences since before she could remember, and she looked out at the pasture. "Mara talked to you," she said. "This morning." "Good." She swung her feet against the bottom rail. "I would have done it myself, but Mara said she needed to do it." "Why did she need to?" June considered that. "Because she's been in charge of this family for 4 years, and being in charge means being the one who never gets to ask for things. She always provides. She never requests." She paused. "Asking you to stay was the first thing she's asked for herself in a long time. She needed to be the one to do it." He stood beside the fence in the fading light and thought about that, about what it costs to be the person who holds everything together, about how that kind of strength is also a kind of loneliness that you don't always see from the outside because it looks so much like capability. "She's not easy," he said. "No," June agreed. "Neither are you." She said it without judgment. "That's probably not a problem." The last of the light was going off the ridge, and the first stars were showing in the east, and the ranch was quiet in the particular way it got at the end of a working day. Not empty, just settled. "You should know," June said, "that I intend to run this ranch properly someday. Not just manage it, expand it, buy back the northern grazing rights that Celine took. Build the herd back up to what it was." She said this with the calm certainty of someone stating a plan rather than a dream. "I'm going to need people who know cattle to make that happen." "I know cattle," Colt said. "I'm aware." She glanced at him sideways. "That's why I'm telling you." She hopped down from the fence and dusted her hands on her coat. "Supper's in an hour. Mara made something that actually has vegetables in it this time, so that's an improvement." She walked back toward the house, and the yard lights came on in the windows, and the smell of wood smoke came down from the chimney with the cold air, and Colt stood at the fence line in the dark for a while longer. He thought about all the towns he'd ridden into and out of, all the mornings he'd woken up in a different place and asked himself what was keeping him, and found no good answer. He thought about the particular emptiness of a life built on not needing anything, how clean it looked, and how it felt at the end of the day when the work was done and there was no particular reason to be anywhere. He thought about 40 yards of fence still needing to be strung before the spring thaw. He put away the tools. He walked across the yard toward the lit windows, and the smell of supper, and the sound, faint through the walls, of 3 women talking over each other in the way that families do. The overlapping, half-finished sentences of people who know each other well enough not to need to complete every thought out loud. He knocked once before he opened the door, which was a habit he'd started in the second week without quite deciding to, and Mara said it's open from across the kitchen without looking up from what she was doing, and June was already setting a 4th plate at the table. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. He sat down. Outside, the wind moved across the pasture, and the fence he'd mended stood in the dark, holding the boundary of a place that belonged to the people inside it. Not perfectly, not without scars, not in any way that made the last 4 years smaller or the hard months ahead simpler, but held. That was enough. That was, in the end, the thing that mattered. Not the dramatic moments, not the standoffs or the legal victories or the nights that could have gone wrong and didn't. It was the ordinary thing, the held ground, the daily decision to stay in it. Colt Mercer had spent a long time being a man who passed through. He picked up his fork. He stayed.